here at UW Stevens Point. And I'd like to thank you for coming tonight for the first lecture of our second season of community college lectures that we're having, sponsored by the College of Letters and Science. We have this evening Dr. Amy Gervasio. She's going to be talking about traumatic brain injury. You may have heard her interview this morning on 10:10 a.m. with Judge Finn. She gave us a little bit of a taste of what she's going to be speaking about. And I just want to talk a minute here just to introduce Amy, and then I'll turn it over to her. One other thing to note is that you may have noticed Michael Martin in the back videotaping this. This lecture will be webcast, as are the lectures from last year. And so if you know somebody who couldn't come tonight, in about a week or so, it will be posted on the college website, and so they can go there and see the lecture. Amy comes to us from a graduate program at The Ohio State University where she did her doctorate in clinical psychology, and she came to UWSP in 1997. Before that, she had a number of appointments, one at Hamilton College in Utica, New York. She was also serving as a fellow at the Medical College of Virginia, and ultimately for 5 years directed the Medical College's rehabilitation center. Is that right?
Sort of.
Okay,
Psychology. That makes me sound like I had more power.
Rehabilitation. She is the author of numerous articles focusing on brain injury, and she also maintains a small practice here in Stevens Point, in addition to serving as an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. So, with no further ado, help me welcome Dr. Amy Gervasio.
Thank you very much. In the grand tradition of lectures, I actually have some handouts. I only made 20 because I'm not sure how many people wanted them. And they have some of the PowerPoint slides, not all of them, but some of them that relate to family. So I'll pass them out, and if you want one, I gather that something can be posted also on the university website later, Katie. So we'll just stick here. So unlike my students, you're not going to say, wait, you didn't have that one. Let me write it down exactly. Right? It's just kind of a guide and an aid. So, how to begin? Tonight I'm going to talk about traumatic brain injury, which refers to injuries to the brain that happen typically as a result of accidents. And although other kinds of brain injuries, which are sometimes called acquired, such as aneurysms or stroke or tumors, can create some of the same effects, I'm going to focus a little bit more on traumatic brain injury, partly because people with traumatic brain injuries often get better, and they certainly survive more than, let's say, people with certain kinds of brain tumors. But if you have a person in your family who has suffered from some of these other things, you may see yourselves, I hope you do, because some of the things are the same. Okay. About 5 to 7 million people actually suffer from brain injuries in the United States. And I took this from the Brain Injury Association of Wisconsin website, had data for 2004, and as you can see, about 5,000 people suffered from traumatic brain injury in our state in 2004. So it's something that is not a negligible amount of people. Many times brain injury goes underreported. Someone's in an auto accident, they break their ribs, they break a leg, maybe they hit their head, we don't know, and then they start to show some strange changes. And it's at that point, sometimes several months later, that people go back and they try to see whether or not a brain injury occurred. So it's pretty much understood that often this is underreported. Here's some more statistics, and then I'll end the statistics portion of the talk. Brain injury isn't random. Men are more likely to have traumatic brain injuries than women. Anybody want to know why? Guess why? More risk-taking, more
active.
Partially? I don't think that's entirely true. For the 18-year-olds in the next line, it is. But women, dangerous professions. People can be injured at work. I once worked with a man who had a huge spool of wire. It was about 12 feet across, come down and hit him on the head, so they're in more dangerous professions. They also drive more, and men do get more speeding tickets and other things than women. Interestingly, it switches at later ages. Some of the more popular ages for brain injury, particularly from accidents and motorcycle accidents, men also drive motorcycles more than women, are age 18, 18 to 24, and then over 65, women who live longer are more likely to fall. But in general, we have many more men than women. Alcohol is involved for 30% of the people with traumatic brain injury. I've even seen some data that suggests as high as 40%. And that may be because the person was drinking while driving, or they may be a passenger, but who was with a person who also drank, etc. And alcohol involvement actually complicates the recovery of the brain, so it's not a good sign. Only 1/3 of people with traumatic brain injury return to their exact former jobs. So if you just take a look at these things, you can begin to see that there are going to be changes in family life, changes in what you can do, changes in your occupation, changes in your roles depending upon what age you are. If you are a person who had a substance abuse problem, that is something that's hard to fix under any circumstance, and it may be more difficult. Your family may finally have to come to grips with this as a problem for you. So a lot of implications for family life. And I'm going to base some of the things that I'm talking about on two people that I worked with in other states many years ago, one named Stan and one named Marie. And Stan was a 42-year-old engineer. He was injured in a single-car accident. He had been legally separated from his wife, who was still the person who was called when he had the injury. And she worked with him and supported him for a while, but there was no doubt that they weren't going to get back together. So not only does this person have to deal with a brain injury, but he had already had marital problems in the first place. Stan had what's called a right-sided injury, and we'll get into that. He had a lot of spatial difficulties, and for someone who does drafting as a mechanical engineer, that's going to cause some problems. His language was fine, and as Stan would say, you know, your family thinks that if you walk and you talk, you are okay. But it became kind of evident that it was going to be difficult for Stan to return to work. And he did for a while at a lower level job and then lost it, partly because, like a lot of brain injured people, at different points he would become easily frustrated. He was a person who had a lot of patience prior to injury, but on the job he would throw things at blackboards and so forth, and finally the company just said, we cannot keep it going. He had some other activities. He also helped take care of an aging mother, which is difficult enough. With a brain injury, it's harder. He had one daughter. But he became extremely depressed and stopped doing activities. He had run a local radio show dealing with Polish music. This is in upstate New York, kind of like here. And stopped doing that, stopped going. And so I met him because a doctor had heard of me and said, maybe even all these years after injury, there's something we can do about depression and something we can do about adjustment to life. So again, here you can begin to see all these different, how families might be changed as a result of injury. Here's a case of Marie. She was 47. She was a homemaker. She was the passenger in the car. Her husband was driving, missed a stop sign, truck came, and he was, of course, unscathed, and she had a pretty severe brain injury. Marie was very assertive prior to injury. She was the kind of person who would be involved in school councils, and if she didn't like something, she would tell people, but she also was a good negotiator. She had 3 children. She didn't get along with her daughter. One of the middle sons left home, and there was still, at the time of her injury, a younger son at home who was kind of a mainstay for the family. She had physical injuries that resembled a stroke. She could not use one of her arms, and so she couldn't drive. It was very hard for her to even get dressed, so she had a lot of physical injuries. Now, Marie had some interesting things going for her. She had an excellent memory. Her short-term memory was not affected. Of course, that meant that she also was very, very willing to always let people know what went wrong and what they did, and Marie carried a grudge. She also had no self-awareness. Instead of being assertive, she was now really aggressive. She would be in a restaurant, she would see something she didn't like, get up and just tell people off. You can see how this means that family members are not really going to want to take you out places and so forth. She had a lot of emotional outbursts, and sometimes people refer to this as personality change. So, I'm not going to talk about the typical effects of brain injury at length tonight. That could be a whole nother lecture. But I'll talk a little bit about some of them because they will also relate to interpersonal interaction and family relationships. There could be lots of physical changes as a result of brain injury, partly because of the accidents, partly because areas in the brain may be affected that deal with your motor functioning. Many brain injured people have constant headaches after brain injury, and a large percentage, about 20 to 30%, develop some kind of seizure. And that can even happen after you've had injury for a while. In fact, Marie started to develop very small seizures while I met her, which was, again, a number of years after brain injury. The major problem in brain injury is, of course, memory or cognitive loss or really slowed functioning, and in particular, short-term memory, memory for everyday, brand new things. And this often annoys family, because how can he remember what happened in 1954 but not remember that he was supposed to put out the garbage, he was supposed to mail a letter, etc. And short-term memory is about those new kinds of memories. A lot of people have what's called emotional dysregulation, and I kind of put this all together here with the term personality change, which a lot of people use. Psychologists don't like that term as much. Emotional dysregulation, you may be very, very quick to anger. You may be very quick to be frustrated. You may even cry. You may get nervous, and it can happen very, very quickly. Behavior change, some people with brain injury become very, very rigid. They have to have things in very obsessive ways. And also interpersonal changes, which we'll get to in a minute. The way you talk to people, you forget about sort of the niceties. Many brain-injured people lack self-awareness. They're not really aware of their own deficits or how they come off to others. Of course, that's not true for everybody. And so sometimes brain-injured people are often thought of as being kind of egocentric. It's hard for them to have empathy for other people, to sort of put themselves in other people's place. And we're talking about people who could do this beforehand. So a lot of changes. Again, I'm not going to give another whole lecture on the brain, but I think it's useful to know a little bit about the brain. And when I work with my clients, we usually start out with a picture of the brain. We look at their neuropsychological report and try to teach them a little bit about what has happened. Lots and lots of people will tell you that nobody does this. When you're in the hospital, your life is being taken care of, but often you don't get a lot of education. And I think that even people with limited loss can understand certain things about the brain, and it makes it a little bit clear about why this is happening to you. So we have a number of lobes in the brain, and we'll go into what they look like. The next slide. I want to talk just a minute about what's called the motor strip. Motor strip is right here in our brains on each side, and it controls every piece of voluntary movement in our bodies. One of the things about strokes and aneurysms is they tend to happen in arteries and veins that are right here that control the sounds that we make for speech. Many people with brain injury also get hit on this side, and so they may have very thick speech. And that's not necessarily a problem in using language, that's a problem in the actual motor coordination of language. And this is why your speech pathologist and your speech therapist is a wonderful person to have if this should happen to you. But there are many brain injured people who don't have motor strip problems, and you would never know that they had a brain injury. So we have some lobes. This is looking in the other direction. And I'm going to talk about things that relate more to cognition and emotion that then relate to the family. So the frontal lobe is right up here, and our frontal lobes, to put it mildly, are really important in our abstract thinking, in our ability to plan and to think of complex ideas, our ability to sequence. Also, there are connections in the frontal lobes that relate to emotion. In accidents, people often hit their head on the windshield. Their frontal lobes are smushed. The resulting problems that they have often relate to an inability to put something in order, to think about the future, but also our frontal lobes inhibit or stop behavior. And when frontal lobes are damaged, often our people with brain injury cannot inhibit being nasty. They can't stop anger as it wells up. And so frontal lobe damage is something that's very, very difficult to handle and difficult for families to deal with. And many people don't realize that they have that. I can remember a young client. We were in a group, sitting at a table. His girlfriend was there, and he got up and said, "I don't know why everybody says I'm always angry. What the hell is the matter with you people?" The girlfriend says, "Honey, I think you've just done it." He kind of stopped for a minute. Oh, is that what they mean? But having that insight doesn't mean you can stop it. So frontal lobe damage has a lot of implications for family life. If we go around the brain, parietal lobe damage is an area of the brain we don't understand as well, but it seems to put signals together from different senses. When we look at something, we also might hear a noise that's coming from it. It guides us. And for many people with parietal lobe damage, it seems hard for them to put together information from their senses. The occipital lobe, anybody know what that's for? None of my colleagues. Vision. And so that's the projection center of the brain. We see with our brains, and occipital lobe damage can result in vision loss. But we're starting to learn that there are portions of the occipital lobe that also seem to relate to visual memory, and so that can have implications. Back here is the brainstem, or the cerebellum, and the cerebellum does a lot of things for us. It relates to gait and balance. It keeps our different systems going along with the brainstem. And underneath parts of the cerebellum and the temporal lobe are really important things that relate to emotion once again. So then we get to the temporal lobe. Oops. I'll do it this way. Is that better? Here, underneath our ears, a lot of important functions. One of the main functions of the temporal lobe is processing sound, language, but we also have an important system that's kind of bordering on everything, the limbic system. It's from the French limbique, which means to border, and there are two really important things that are often damaged in brain injury, and one is the hippocampus. Anybody know what the hippocampus seems to be responsible for? Switchboard is part of it, but memory in particular. So it seems to be a place where memory is involved. And also next to it is the amygdala, this little almond-shaped thing, and that seems to be a repository for helping us regulate emotion. And again, there's recent research that there are connections between the hippocampus and the amygdala that relate to emotional memories, things that we don't always verbalize that may be triggered. So a lot of really important things that are happening. And so many times we make an assumption that if you had a temporal lobe injury and the amygdala was hurt, this may also be a reason that you have some of these personality changes and emotional changes. So that is the quickest lecture on the brain you will get, but it gives you a kind of idea of what might be happening. We also have some language areas of the brain, usually on the left side of the brain. We'll get into that right now. And then we have some left and right differences. Now, here's where we don't want to be popular psychologists. You've probably seen books like Drawing with the Right Side of the Brain, you know, and stuff like that. The brain really works in a coordinated fashion, but some parts of the hemispheres are better than others. And so for our purposes, we're going to take a look at a couple of different things. The left hemisphere seems to be extremely important in things that require sequencing. Language requires sequencing, even certain kinds of music, doing things in order. Many brain-injured people have real trouble following through. They can tell you what they need to do, but they can't do it. Verbal memory seems to be important in the left hemisphere. But the right hemisphere has some interesting things that we ignore. The right hemisphere seems to process wholes, shapes, better than sequences. And one of the things that we're learning about is that emotional expression on the face seems to be processed in the right hemisphere. Now, if you think about a face, it is really a visual image. It's a shape. We understand interpersonal relationships not just based on what we say, but the way our faces look. And so if I said to you, this is a really big crowd, my words have told you it's a big crowd. What did my voice tone do? It was sarcasm. It took it away, right? It's not really big. If I had said, this is a really big crowd. Now, my voice tone is fine, but the nonverbal behavior of my face tells you something else. If you have damage to the right side of the brain after brain injury, often people with this problem do not read interactions very well. They don't read faces very well.